All right, gang, welcome back. This is part 2 of Chapter 4. And in the first part, we learned the flow-through of cost through the process costing system. Now we're going to go ahead and jump into an example and see how things are done here. We discussed also equivalent units of production. And so in this example information here, remember our company has two departments. Department A is the first department, then Department B. So Department A of the company will do whatever it does. In your homework example, you're going to be dealing with a juice manufacturer, a beverage manufacturer, and they make tropical juices. So in that example, the first department is responsible for juicing the fruits and actually making the liquid, and their finished product would of course be large vats or big containers of the beverage that they're going to be selling. The second department would be the bottling department. So they would take, of course, the material, the finished product from Department A, which is the juice, and that's one of their raw materials. But they would, of course, add their own new raw materials, which would be things like bottles, labels, and caps that might go on the top of the bottle. And, of course, the labor to fill these bottles and to put the labels on and apply them properly, or even quality control if everything's automated, just to review and check them. And then everything else that goes into it would be the overhead for the second department. But we're going to deal with Department A for now. I just wanted to explain what two departments might seem like in a processing department. So what we're looking at here is the work in process account of Department A. And we're looking at basically the month of June. So on June 1st, the department, if somebody were to go in there and count, had 300 units in states of partial completion. And here's how they were completed. They were about 40% complete with respect to materials and about 20% complete with respect to everything else. That's labor and the rest of manufacturing overhead. And don't worry yourself or concern your minds with coming up with these percentages. These will always be provided to you, as in the real world they would be provided by the business managers themselves. But we need to know what to do with them and how to apply them. Next, of course, is the units started into production. So we had 300 units that were about partially completed, and we started on another 6,000 units during the period. So we had 6,300 under production during the period. Now, of those, we finished 5,400 units of production, if you want to think of that as 5,400 large vats of fruit juice for our example. And we finished those and we transferred those on to the bottling department, right? But we were left with about 900 units or 900 vats, which were about 60% done with respect to materials and only 30% done with respect to everything else, labor being applied to them and all other manufacturing overhead being applied. So if we were to calculate the equivalent units of production for this department, the Department A, or in our example, the assembly department, in your homework, of course, it would be the juicing department. How would we come up with the equivalent units of production? Remember, of course, this is what we memorized. Equivalent units of production for a department are equal to the units completed and transferred out during the period and the ending work in process equivalent units based upon the percentage of completion. So let's take a look at what it would look like if we calculate that out. First of all, and we're going to keep it into two separate columns to keep things simple. With respect to materials, of course, what we transferred out was 5,400 and conversion 5,400, right? Those were 100% complete, so the total amount comes in here. Now what's an ending work in process? Remember, there's 900 units that are 60% complete with respect to materials. Just multiply that out and get the product. And with respect to conversion, again, there was 900 units, but they were only 30% complete with respect to the rest of the manufacturing overhead costs. And that's the conversion costs, remember. So multiply that out, and you will have two different equivalent units of production for the department during June. And you are going to do this in your homework and in the exam problems. Keep it in two separate columns, one with respect to materials and one with respect to conversion, so that we can easily calculate our equivalent units of production. And again, I put in this reminder up top here. Equivalent units of production is always equal to the units completed and transferred out plus the equivalent units remaining in work in process as calculated here as an example. All right. The next part, of course, once we've determined the number of equivalent units, We now need to compute a cost per equivalent unit using that weighted average method. And this, of course, is the formula to do that. We take the cost of the beginning work in process inventory, add to that the cost of the units added during the period, and divide by the equivalent units of production which we just determined to come up with the cost per equivalent unit. And then we can assign that to every single unit that we've got. Let me show you what I mean. Remember that in our last example, this was just units. We don't have any cost information, right? In the beginning work in process, we had 300 units that were partially completed. We added 6,000. We completed 5,400, and we're left with 900, right? These will, of course, be equal to the sum of these. Now, what we're going to add to that is cost information, which is shown here in blue. The information in black, these 300 units plus the 6,000 units, and the 5,400 that we completed and transferred out, and the 900 that we ended with in ending work in process inventory. We already had that information. What we're adding now is the cost information, which once again will be provided to you. So the 300 units that were in beginning work in process, the cost of the percentage of completion that was done with respect to materials is shown here in blue, and the cost for the percent of complete or the equivalent units is shown here in blue with respect to conversion. Same thing for the costs that were added to production in June. And that's the cost of these 6,000 that were added, right? So now we're getting additional cost information. Now what we're going to do is apply that formula that we just learned so that we can come up with a cost of equivalent units of production. So we will take the cost of the beginning work in process with respect to materials, add that to the cost of the inventory that we added with respect to materials, and come up with a total cost with respect to materials. Do the same thing for the conversion figures that we just received, and then divide by the equivalent units which we, of course, calculated in part 1, right? The ending equivalent units of production, which is units completed and transferred out, plus those in ending inventory with respect to each materials and conversion. So we're going to divide those out, and now we will have a cost per equivalent unit of production. And these are the costs that we will apply to all of the units, both that were transferred to the next department and that remain in ending work in inventory for the work in process of Department A, so that we know a cost amount to assign to all those units. You could, of course, take the total, but we will keep working with them individually to keep things simple for us, materials and conversion. Let's go ahead and assign the cost to the units using that weighted average method. Step 1, of course, is just to list out the equivalent units of production, which were 500, and this is in ending work in process inventory, right? With respect to materials, it was 540. With respect to conversion cost, it was 270. That's the ending work in process. We're going to multiply those out by their cost per equivalent unit, and then we total that up, and that would be the total cost of ending work in process inventory for Department A. Do the same thing for the units that we transferred out. We know it was 5,400, 100% complete with respect to both materials and conversion. Apply those cost per equivalent unit that we calculated, multiply those out, and add the total up, and this is now the cost that we have transferred from work in process of Department A to work in process of Department B. And the last part of Chapter 4 is to prepare, of course, a cost reconciliation report. And all that does is assure that our costs from beginning work in process inventory plus the additions are equal to what we transferred out and the ending work in process inventory, which should remind you of handout number 2 from Chapter 1, which we will be using over and over, and that's the inventory systems, which shows beginning work in process plus additions to inventory, gives you your total amount available, And of course, you can subtract out either your ending work in process inventory to come out with the amount that was transferred out, or vice versa. But in order to write out a reconciliation report, of course, you just start off with the cost of beginning work in process inventory plus the cost added to the production during the period, and this will of course be given to you, right? You're just going to add in the with respect to materials and conversion for each of these so that you get a total. Total those up, and that's the total cost to be accounted for. Now we just want to compare that to our ending work in process inventory and the cost of the inventory that we transferred out. The totals of each of those must be equal to each other. And if you've got that, your reconciliation is done and you've appropriately accounted for the cost of work in process inventory. Refer back to that slide number 2 from Chapter 1. I'll post it here on the Web Campus page with the PowerPoint and the videos for this lecture as well for easy review, but I think it will help as you go through Chapter 4. That is the end of Chapter 4. Enjoy.